Welcome back to Quick Theological Thoughts. I'm Howard Fisher, and on this podcast, I want to interact with Charlie Kirk and his bunch. This is a group of, I think, are all Christian guys, and they're discussing the Satanic temple altar that was destroyed in Iowa at this point of this particular podcast, and the controversy that what's free speech. What's the separation of church and state and that kind of thing. And we've kind of hinted at some of that before, but let's go ahead and thanks to my daughter, I'm using different software. So this makes it a whole lot easier. I'm using this OBS studio, so it's kind of fun trying to figure out, I'm kind of old, so I got the old man learning curve going here. But anyway, so we got Charlie Kirk, who's going. They just got through discussing First Amendment issues, and how this Satanic temple was, wrecked by some military pilot or some ex-military pilot who went in there and cut off its head or something like that. And so what's the issue here? What's at the core? What's liberty? What's freedom? What's religious freedom? What's the role of the state and that kind of thing? And so let's get into that here real quick, and we'll interact with the videos as it goes.
Yeah. So the question is, let's look at, so this particular incident, was this person doing the will of God, or should he have submitted to the satanic symbol?
And I need to mention that they did read Romans 13. And I appreciated their take on Romans 13 because they recognize that Romans 13, the Christian is to submit to authority. And yet, when that authority commands you to do something that contradicts God's law, God's will, they did recognize, when do we do that? How bad does it have to get first before you go ahead and say, nope. They read certain scripture passages like from Exodus when the women did not kill the babies as they were commanded to do, and God blessed them for it, those kinds of things. So they refer to Daniel in the lion's den and passages like that. So I think these guys are on the right trajectory, right? I'm going to throw some thoughts in here in a minute that I think need to be added to the conversation.
So let's pretend that it wasn't a troll, because it probably is some form of a troll. Again, I get pretty.
Or, I mean,
if I see,
what if it's a Muslim display? What?
All right. So this guy on the left has been saying, look, just ignore it, right? Just ignore it. They'll go away, right? And I would typically agree with that in a lot of cases. It takes wisdom to know when you interact with a fool and when you shouldn't interact with a fool, right? But is this, so this guy is discussing, when's too far? When do we react? How do we react? And he takes more of the, just ignore these guys. And do we really want to ignore these guys? Because what's the real purpose of all this? And that's what we're going to get into. Why do the quote-unquote devil worshippers, satanic worshippers, Satan worshippers, why are they really doing this? We all know it's not because they really worship the devil, right? And that's what this guy was saying. But Charlie Kirk kind of had responded to that and said, no, we got to respond in some way, because it's about the foundation. And at least Charlie Kirk caught some of that.
Would it have been okay if he smashed up an Islamic display?
It's a good question.
Or even, you could say...
So the reason why we don't care about, the reason why we do care about the satanic display, that would answer this question, right? So this guy's, look, let's ignore the satanic thing because, what if it's a Muslim display at the state capitol, right? So now here's the problem, right? So if we have freedom of speech, then we have to have freedom of speech for everybody. But again, this is where we're getting to the myth of neutrality. This is where we're getting into the myth of, what is religion? When does the state have the right to restrict religion? Of course not. So in the United States, we protect religious freedom. We protect freedom of speech. So the question is, can you put, if Christians can put a display of the nativity scene at Christmas time at the state capitol, why can't the Satanic group do their thing? And so this guy just wants to ignore them, because if you do, then but this is the myth of neutrality, right? This is where the state takes the secular position and says all things are equal. Now, do we really believe that? No. And so Charlie Kirk saying, no, it's satanic. It's not really a religion. Get rid of it. But then the obvious question comes up. The obvious question comes up. What about the Muslim religion? Do they get a right to put on display their stuff? That's a good question. Right. If you don't have the right grounding. See, we Christians have been so pushed into trying to be neutral, that the state has to be neutral, that the state can't imbibe any particular religion. Well, that's just baloney, right? It's the myth of neutrality. I know we've talked about that before, but the question is, what is the role of the state? They just got through reading Romans 13 a little bit ago. The state is the minister of God. God establishes the state. Now, if everybody's an atheist and nobody believes in God, well, then the state's going to reflect that, right? If the people are Christian, and hopefully the state would reflect that, because hopefully people take their Christianity seriously, because as the guy second from the right said earlier in this particular podcast, Christ is Lord. And let's get away from the myth of neutrality, right? So if I want to read a particular verse. This is from Psalm chapter 2. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Clay vessels, right? Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warnings, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. So God speaks to the nations. And there are lots of prophecies throughout the Old Testament that tells us of the nations coming to the Lord, right? So kings are warned. So the problem isn't the satanic display. The problem is Christians don't know what to do. In past generations, when we were a majority of Christians in the United States, this wasn't an issue, right? The issue was, do the Episcopalians versus the Baptists, okay? The issue was never, what if Islam becomes, what? No, Christ is Lord, right? Christ is Lord. And the laws that we make have to reflect God's character, right? Every nation has to do that. When you say thou shalt not murder, what's the grounding of that? There's no moral neutrality to this, okay? You can't say, well, we all agree from our various viewpoints. No, we have to ground it in something. And you can't say we ground it in secularism, because secularism isn't a thing. It doesn't have a grounding, right? Stick 10 secularists in a room and you can have radically contradictory viewpoints that make absolutely no sense in themselves at all, because it's secularism. There's nothing there. It has no grounding in itself. So Christians, when we go to tackle questions like this, we have to be able to think, hey, well, what is the grounding of all this? What is free speech? how does the state, what is the role of the state, and how can the state acknowledge the one true God while not using the sword to advance Christianity? Well, we have to have a fair and firm understanding of what the Bible has to say about the role of the state. The role of the state absolutely has to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. It's right from the beginning. It's what Jesus and the apostles go right out and do. Jesus even tells Pontius Pilate, "You would have no authority over me if it were not granted to you from above." Jesus had no problem telling Pontius Pilate, "Your authority comes from God." Why would we not do the same today? Jesus, let me repeat that because I think it's an important point. Jesus is Lord, and he explains that to Pontius Pilate. You would have no authority over me unless it were granted to you from above. You are a minister of God to exercise judgment against crimes, against criminals, against evildoers. That's the point of Romans 13. So many Christians today are just taking Romans 13 and running away with it and way into left field. Romans 13 is, we should all recognize that the authority that that the state has as a minister of God comes from God, and they only have the authority which God grants to them. To go any farther than that is a problem. And that's the foundation to the answer to this question about Islam. What about Islam? Well, if we're Christian, we don't recognize Islam as the grounding. Now, listen to Charlie Kirk's answer.
They worship
I will say
Hindu display, so
Islam
a pagan
is
one.
more of a religion. It is an Abrahamic faith. I mean, they do at least venerate Mary and Jesus. Like Satanism is just like a complete middle finger.
Well, now
That's not an answer, right? That's not a grounding. So, well, we're not going to let them do it because they're this, and we're going to do it because there's that. This is where Christians are embracing the myth of neutrality. He's, on the one hand, he's saying that we have to have a grounding, right? They kind of argued earlier that Christianity is true, but then what do you do with this? Well, Islam is an Abrahamic faith. Fair enough, right? It's an Abrahamic faith, supposedly, right? That's the claim. They are descendants of Abraham. But we clearly do not, they don't worship the triune God, right? That if you talk to a Muslim and they were to listen to this, they'd be like, we got these guys on the ropes. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to answer that question, and the Muslims love it. Okay? The Christian has to stand firm at this point. Christianity is true. Islam is not. Okay? Are we going to put forth a Muslim display? Well, if the majority of this country were Muslim, they'd be doing it. That's not a question for the Muslim, right? But for the Christian, what the problem here is, we want to be fair to people. We have a sense of fairness, okay? But that fairness has to come from where? Okay, it doesn't come from Islam. It comes from Scripture. Okay, we believe in the law of the law that's throughout the Bible tells us about the general equity for all men, right? So the law of God is to be applied fairly and equally to all. Well, but what do we do with the nativity display versus some kind of Muslim display at the state capitol? Christianity is the grounding for the ability to have general equity in favor, or without favoring any particular group, without favoring any particular individual or any corporation or company or whatever, right? Everybody's equal before the law, and that comes from the fact and the truth that Jesus is Lord. So the state honoring the very foundation for law by acknowledging that Christ is Lord, I mean, the only way that you could probably make an argument is, the state's just not going to say put up religious symbols. Okay, you could say that, but what about the Ten Commandments? Can we put the Ten Commandments up on the wall? If you're going to remove that, then you end up taking away the very foundation that grants to us the freedoms and liberties that we possess. Right? So, how far does that go? And that part to me would be the discussion. What is the role of the state? Well, the role of the state has to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. It has to. If it doesn't, then your liberties you're borrowing whatever liberties that are left, you're borrowing them from Christianity because you don't have a grounding for it. So let's press on. I think I beat that to death.
Now we got Hindus, so it's a polytheistic religion.
Yeah, what about the polytheistic religion?
Polish MP who smashed up a menorah.
He doused it with a fire extinguisher.
Oh, that's right, with the fire extinguisher.
Definitely shouldn't do that.
All right, so Charlie Kirk says we definitely shouldn't be, dishonoring the menorah. Okay, fine, but why are we going to put all these different kinds of religious symbols up there? So we can have a debate about that, but if the state is going to acknowledge the menorah, we have to ask why, right? What's the purpose of that? Well, we have another group of people over here we don't want to exclude. Well, look, the grounding for law is the scriptures. You take that away, what are you left with, right? So what does the menorah have to do with that? The point is the Son is Lord, and that's what we're acknowledging as Christians. And by that, we are able to say to our neighbors who are not Christian, you come under the law of God just as we all do, with equity, right? The law applies to us equally. The Lady Justice who has a blindfold over her. That principle, it can only come from Christianity because it can only come from the one true God. That's the problem here. And as far as Hinduism, it's not. Sorry, it's not. It's out to lunch. It's polytheistic. And the problem with secularism is that in pretending to be neutral and, we're a blended society. Well, you're just arguing for polytheism. So, to take the secularist underpinnings is to argue for a version of Hinduism, really.
The Polish Senate.
So are you saying, Blake, that Satanists don't actually believe in that?
Yeah, I mean, Satanists
gotta be a few.
They use Satan as a metaphorical representation of like humanist values. So they're like, we're, atheists, humanists. There are different branches of it. I should clarify. There's kind of 2 or 3 different strands of Satanism. Because you have Satanism that is sort of like, I'm a Redditor who's going to rebel against my parents, and
which is basically this one.
Yeah, which means like Satan stands for science. There's kind of a Nietzschean Satanism. I think that's Levian or whatever you'd call him.
That's Church of Satan.
Yeah, Church of Satan. And so that's its own kind of, it's like a libertarian worldview that views Satan as like the ultimate rebel who can't be, whose authority does not rein him in. So that one cares more about the idea of like, oh, let's embody the principles of what we think Satan believes, but it is still not really, it doesn't worship Satan except to say that like, actually the Satan as described in the Bible is like totally fine. Like he had it right.
All right. So what's being argued there is, look, they're putting this display, they want to put this display in to show that we're all equal under the law. The problem is that what you're doing is you're saying all foundations are equal under the law because secularism is God. See, it's not that secularism is trying to pretend that there's no God. We just don't want any God, and that all religions are represented equally at the state, or all peoples are represented equally at the state, or however they might put it. And that's, again, it's the myth of neutrality, right? So we're right back to you can practice your religion in private, you just can't put it in the public square. Well, then we don't have anything, right? The Christian has nothing. The Christian is now standing on secular ground in order to say that murder is wrong? Where are we going to go with this? How far does this go? I think we've gone as far as we can. Now we're living in a day where we don't even know what a boy is. We don't know what a girl is. We have guys in women's sports, right? They don't know what to do because let's face it, all of this is grounded in religion, right? So the Satanists is, they're not Satanists. They're just saying, look, we want to get religion out of the public square. And if you're going to get rid of this, then you have to get rid of that. No, because we have a different category for how we are looking at this. And we're looking at it from the fact that Christ is Lord. And God demonstrated that he is Lord by raising him from the dead. And that's where Christians must start. And this guy isn't starting there for sure. And so that's the problem. And so he's putting forward objections, and they're good objections if you stand on secular ground. And that's where he's standing. And the Christian can't stand there because we're not morally neutral. It's not a matter of if there's a God. It's a matter of which God is Lord of this nation. Which one? The secular God, or is Jesus Lord? So that's really the question that's how I would frame it. So anyway, that's my quick theological thought for the day. God bless. Be good.